All right. So we are finishing up our study of Ruth this evening, and then we're going to be getting into our study of Gamaliel, Joseph of Arimathea, and Nicodemus. I got those in the wrong order there. But that is the plan for this evening. Let me get this situated here. Okay. So, as we read through the last of the text of Ruth, and so as we end our questions, I left my notes in for my Ruth questions. I left in my office. So the last, I think it's the last three questions that are on our paper. Can somebody read the first of the last three questions for us?
What kind of character is shown in Ruth being willing to become the wife of an older man?
Okay. All right, so we actually talked about that one last week. We finished up that one in describing the fact that she was willing to submit to the culture as well as the law that was provided, but she was submissive in that. In fact, Boaz himself even says, your kindness is greater at the end than at the beginning, because you weren't drawn away by young men and so forth, but instead you submitted yourself to take care of Naomi and to follow the traditions and the law of the Jews. What about the second to last question?
What adjectives can be used to describe Ruth?
Okay, what adjectives can be used to describe Ruth? And we've used a lot in the course of our study. Sorry?
Loyal.
Loyal? Yeah, loyal. Virtuous? Trusting. Yeah, very trusting. Absolutely. Hardworking. Absolutely, hardworking. What else? Serving or a submissive servant. Selfless. That's a good one. Yeah.
I'd say righteous.
Righteous.
She had the choice to go back.
Right.
For people and knew that was wrong.
And not only that, but at any point, really, even when she was out there working and stuff, I guess she could have technically gone back, but she didn't. When she kind of made that vow or oath or the statement, at least to Naomi, that your people will be my people, your God will be my God, she meant it. Okay, she meant it, and she in every way. In fact, we talk about Rahab. Whatever Rahab had to do to become a proselyte, however that worked for the Gentile women, I'm sure that's what Ruth did as well, to become a proselyte, to become obedient to the law as a Gentile woman. Anything else?
Trusting.
Yep, trusting. Yep.
Wise. In her choices and decisions.
And especially given the fact that, generally she's considered to be a young woman, having that wisdom of relying on the wisdom of the older people, that relying on Naomi, relying on Boaz, the wisdom of allowing her to, she obviously had the ability to really process what she was doing when she was doing it. And a lot of young people don't have that pause, that ability to filter things properly. A lot of times, young people, and older people too, we see it in Peter, tend to be impulsive, maybe tend to act before they think, leap before they look, and certainly Ruth is kind of a exception to that. What about the last question? This is the one, what characteristics should we seek to emulate, or how can we take her example and apply it to ourselves? Obviously, we're talking about a very different category in terms of culture. Okay, so obviously a lot of the specific cultural things may not apply. But obviously we could talk about all the characteristics that certainly can apply, but what else? I mean, obviously all those characteristics we just talked about are things that we're told to be in the New Testament. Okay, trusting, loyal, righteous, all of that, submissive, a servant. But what about Ruth's character can we take and apply for ourselves?
We don't know much of her background before she married, and don't know if she had many of these qualities before.
Right.
But through the influence of Naomi, she developed those or honed them in, or because she's unusual, because she's not even a Jew.
Right.
Yet she has the qualities that probably most Jews wish they had,
Yeah.
wish most people had, that either from the influence of the Jewish family or her mother-in-law or the rest of Jews, people notice.
Yeah.
And, even Boaz noticed and had heard about her before he even met her.
Yeah.
That this was the Moabite woman, quote, that this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It's that thing that she was someone special.
Right. Her reputation preceded her.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And whether that happened or upbringing or the influence of Naomi or both,
Right.
we see that she listened
Right.
to Naomi, followed instructions very closely. So whatever Naomi's example was to her had a big influence.
Right.
That she would listen and she would do and she would obey and then all the characteristics we've already named.
Right.
about her.
And I think that's a really important quality of having a reputation of one, as Boaz mentioned, of being virtuous, okay, of being blameless. And especially in that Jewish society, you got to figure that this Moabite woman, they're going to be paying careful attention to see just exactly what type of behavior she shows, what type of character she shows, and everything she did, Boaz recognized that everyone views you as blameless. Okay, and that says a lot about her character. And of course, we know as individuals seeking to serve God, should we have a good reputation among others? Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, that's borne out. I mean, we look at the qualifications and characteristics of elders, that they have a good report from the outside. Those who they are involved with, those who are non-Christians, that even they can say about them that they have a good and honest character. Over and over again, we're encouraged to set the right example, especially in the case of persecution or in hardship, so that it goes to support the teaching of the gospel and not bring shame upon it. And that's a key component as well. So, when you look at Ruth's example and you look at everything that Ruth was and did, certainly the fact that she didn't do it obviously she didn't do it for the reputation purpose, but she was what she represented herself as. Okay, she didn't pretend to be one thing in public, but then in private was a completely different person. And I think that especially as Christians, we have to be aware that we're not wearing some kind of mask when we're with our brethren, when we're talking to certain people, and then when we're on our own or we're at home or whatnot, we act completely differently. Okay, what would you call that? What would you call somebody like that? Hypocrite. And this is why a lot of times you see individuals reject Christianity or reject Christians or organized religion, because in their mind, maybe they've had a really bad experience with some type of situation like that. And so in their mind, they blanketly think that all people who claim to be Christians are hypocrites. We have to be very careful not to support that notion, that we show that we're different than what maybe other people claim to be but aren't. And so I think that's a very good aspect of Ruth that we can take and emulate. Anybody have anything else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, from chapter 1, verse 8, Naomi's trying to send the two daughters-in-law back. She says, "Go return east to your mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as ye have dealt with the dead and with me." It impresses me, her character has impressed Naomi.
Already at that point, yeah.
Of how she has dealt with whichever son she was married to. And so I think the lesson learned is in the role of family, husband and wife, mother-in-law to daughter-in-law, whatever that relationship we're in,
Mm-hmm.
how we act. is a lesson that can be learned.
Yeah, that's a good point, because Naomi obviously trusted Ruth. We talk about a lot, and of course, through the course of our study, we've looked at characteristics of Naomi, we've looked at characteristics of Boaz as well, and certainly it's not just Ruth that shows these attributes, but the fact that Naomi and Boaz, in their dealings with Ruth, because of her character, and it certainly does go to show this incredible acknowledgement of the role that Ruth served as a daughter-in-law. Ultimately, Naomi calls her daughters. Okay, she never actually refers to them as my daughter-in-law or as my son's wife. It's her daughters. So obviously, there was this kind of adopting by Naomi to these young ladies, but particularly Naomi as she went along with her, or particularly of Ruth as she went along with Naomi. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, that you have dealt kindly with the dead and with me. And I think it was Mahlon that Ruth was married to, and then Orpah was married to Chilion, I believe is the way that worked. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Well, you're right there. I appreciate Joe bringing us back to this. So, verse 8, each of you return to her mother's house.
Mm-hmm.
Go back home. Verse 9, the Lord grant you may find rest each in the house of her husband,
Mm-hmm.
which were Naomi's sons. They
Mhm.
were Judah. I mean, they're now dead, but so exactly what's he?
I think what Naomi is referring to in verse 9 is that they will remarry. I believe that's kind of how I have taken that they're now released from serving Naomi, and so Ruth and Orpah can go home to their father's house.
You're reading it as a future husband?
As a future husband. Yeah, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Once you go home, you're freed from obligation to me or my dead sons, and so you're free to remarry. And so I took that verse 9 as, obviously they're not going to be staying in the house of their husband. At least she's trying to send them away. And so I took that as your future husband. You're going to remarry. They're still young, and they can still have children. They can still have families. And so I took verse 9 as, I hope that you'll have a good life, that you'll remarry and find peace in the house of your next husband, is kind of how I took verse 9. Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Any other thoughts on that? Yes, sir.
No, but I have another question.
Okay.
How does the intermarrying with foreigners fit into this book? The prohibition of Israelites doing that.
That's a very good question, because obviously Ruth, it's my understanding that as here in chapter 1, we see how that Naomi and her husband moved to Moab, but then after they got to Moab, verse 2, it sounds as if that's when, verse 4, they took wives of the women of Moab. Yeah, so it's not like they married these women when they were in Judah. I'm guessing there weren't a lot of, probably no, Jewish women available. Maybe that was their reasoning behind it. There weren't any Jewish women available, so we don't really have much of a choice here if we're going to continue the lineage. But as you point out, God was insistent, hey, you don't need to be intermarrying with people from other lands, particularly because of those evil influences that were taking place. Now, obviously, it worked the other way around with Naomi and Ruth and presumably Orpah as well, but Orpah went home. So I don't know in terms of the violation of that. And certainly in the examples we have of, like we talked about Samson before, and how Samson seemed to kind of be a wandering individual, particularly being attracted to women who weren't of the house of Israel. And yet, even though we can say Samson, that wasn't a very wise thing to do, we don't necessarily see God saying you broke the law. I guess sometimes I've wondered about how that worked in terms of, was it all of the people kind of as a policy intermarrying that was condemned, but like one-offs like Samson and that sort of thing maybe was different? I don't know. But it is kind of an interesting situation that we're not really giving commentary about that particularly, as it applied to the Mosaic law.
Throw the possibility of proselyting into that.
Well, yeah, and that's the other possibility. And it's possible that Orpah and Ruth had already been proselytized, even though it doesn't happen till later that Ruth says, your God will be my God, and so forth. That's possible. And so that might be the exception to that rule, although I don't think Samson's wife was, there's no indication she was a proselyte, but, that could be. That could be that if there's maybe proper acknowledgement that we're not serving the foreign gods, maybe there was allowance for that if these women denounced their people's gods or whatever. Maybe there was some kind of an allowance for that. That could be. I don't know. Anything else? Okay. All right. Let's move on to our notes on Gamaliel, Nicodemus, and Joseph of Arimathea. So this character study is kind of based around the rulers of the Jews of the New Testament. In particular, these three. All three of these are considered and called rulers of the Jews at one point or another. It's interesting because these three specifically are also mentioned in connection with the saints to some degree, or with Jesus to some degree. And so I wanted to focus on these. Obviously, we could look at some of the high priests that are mentioned. We could look at those Jews who were involved in the Sanhedrin and considered rulers of the Jews, but these particular ones who were named, I thought were very interesting. And quite frankly, I don't think I've ever had a study specifically on Gamaliel and Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, not on any one of them. And so I kind of thought that would be an interesting thing to look at, going now, since we've left the Old Testament, going back to the New Testament. So what I did was I split it up into basically three sections. You've got Gamaliel, and then Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. Obviously, there are not questions on our notes, because otherwise then there'd be 3 pages and I'd have to staple and all that. But there will be plenty of questions as we go through, I'm sure, as we look at these individuals. So when it comes to Gamaliel, if you look up information, you look at commentaries about Gamaliel, Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, obviously they'll talk about the biblical accounts of where they're mentioned and what all was involved. But then sometimes they'll also include some of the oral traditions, some of the what we would call secular history or legends that, first of all, aren't contained in the Bible, and then in some case aren't necessarily written down as history until a couple centuries after the fact. But about Gamaliel, we see him mentioned only in Acts chapter 5 and in Acts chapter 22. So the only writer of the New Testament who mentions Gamaliel is whom? Luke. Question number 1. Yeah, there was Luke. And we're told he was a teacher of the law. We know that Paul says that he was brought up. That term, it literally means to rear a child. Okay, the phrase that Paul uses in Acts 22 as he's accounting kind of his past and his history, he was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, means he was reared. He was raised by Gamaliel. That doesn't necessarily mean his parents saw Paul's parents were dead, but that when he was in training from a young age. And then he was raised by Gamaliel. The name in Hebrew means reward of God. It's interesting because in Numbers, there's another Gamaliel. It's the only other Gamaliel, as far as we know, in the Bible. And it's son of Pedahzur in Numbers chapter 1, 2, 7, and 10. But whether he was named after that or he was named usually Jewish names were named because of their meaning, not necessarily because of a predecessor or someone in the past necessarily, but reward of God is what that term means. He's thought to have died somewhere around 52 AD, just because of some of the texts that have survived regarding Sanhedrin and so forth. They kind of placed it in that range. The interesting thing about this is the Talmud, which is a Jewish collection of historical accounts, describes Gamaliel as a prince and a master, and records that he was the president, so to speak, of the Sanhedrin. Some scholars doubt this claim, but concede he certainly held a senior position. And so when we think about Gamaliel, especially given his age, of what he must have been, if he raised up Paul from a relatively young age, okay, and we figure Paul, by the time he's converted in Damascus by Ananias, you figure Paul's probably at least in his 30s at that point, then Gamaliel's got to be up there. Okay, and certainly there was, some thought that he was, if not, obviously the high priest would have been, from a priesthood perspective and from a practical perspective regarding things of the law, spiritual things of the law, he was the leader. But in terms of the Sanhedrin was more of the civil center of the administration of the nation of Israel. Gamaliel is considered, if not to have been the leader, certainly one of the senior leaders. And I think that's important to note, because then that also speaks to what regarding Paul or Saul? What is that when he starts going through his history in Galatians chapter 1 and 2 and in Philippians chapter 3, he starts going through his past, and he says, I count all things as loss for the cause of Christ, Philippians 3. What all was included in that? Imagine being raised as the prodigy of perhaps one of the most revered members of the Sanhedrin, one of the most revered teachers of the law, and you have been raised by him, taught by him. Just imagine the influence and the status that would come with that. Never mind, we don't know what kind of wealth Paul may have had access to and whatnot as associated with that too, but just from an influence and status perspective, he left all of that. And so it just kind of helps enhance our appreciation of what Paul was willing to sacrifice because he became a Christian.
And he ran with it too.
Say what?
I mean, he ran with that position.
Oh, yeah.
To the point of, taking letters and
Oh, yeah.
hunting Christians down.
Absolutely. Now, it also kind of shows his connection to a certain extent, to the Sanhedrin. Most people suggest that he was perhaps a junior member of the Sanhedrin, Saul, but regardless, the fact that he took on particular zeal of persecuting the church, Paul, in all good conscience, did that, but it certainly goes to show just how zealous he was for what he had been taught by Gamaliel. Second part of this, Photius of Constantinople, this is again in the 800s AD, records that Gamaliel had embraced the Christian faith and was baptized by Peter and John along with his son Abiban and Nicodemus. There is no way to confirm this. I thought that was kind of interesting, though, that first of all, we see a lot of wisdom from Gamaliel, which we'll get into in a minute, but we don't see Gamaliel necessarily pronouncing any type of belief in Jesus or anything like that. However, if you had this type of father-son relationship between Paul and Gamaliel, what stands to reason that Paul would attempt to do? Yeah. And if Gamaliel really was as wise as he appears to be, and as knowledgeable of the law and the prophets as he was, you would hope that Gamaliel at least would be open-minded, like the Bereans were, in being willing to listen if and when Paul did come, and I would think Paul did at some point try to teach Gamaliel. And so you would think or hope that Gamaliel at the very least would listen and think about it, if not become a Christian himself. I mean, Paul's argument to Agrippa was almost enough to convince Agrippa to become a Christian. So I would think Gamaliel would certainly be willing to hear, unless, and I don't think you necessarily see this character from Gamaliel. You see such a hesitant, well thought out behavior from Gamaliel. I don't think Gamaliel would have necessarily just disowned Paul and refused to even hear him or talk to him. I don't think. But I mean, things like that did happen when people became Christians in the New Testament. They got disowned. It's possible that Gamaliel just would refuse to talk to Paul. But I certainly think it is possible, and I say possible. It is possible, and I'm hopeful that Gamaliel was converted at some point. But I think it's interesting every time that I looked at this legend, or this, well, it's a record, but it's 800 years after the fact. It's always in connection with Nicodemus. That he, his son, and Nicodemus were all baptized at the same time. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Just as again, there's no way to confirm that, but I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. Thoughts or comments through that? Okay. So regarding his character, we know that he taught and raised Paul in Jerusalem, And of course, that was in Jerusalem. But where was Paul from? Tarsus. Okay, Tarsus being up kind of at the curve where Turkey and Syria kind of meet together there. Tarsus is up there, way away from Jerusalem. How he ended up in Jerusalem at a young age, we don't really have that background information. But obviously, he was taken to Jerusalem and committed to Gamaliel somehow. Whether his parents had any connection to Gamaliel or what, we don't know. But regardless, Gamaliel took Paul kind of under his wing, raised him, taught him. And according to Paul in Acts 22, Paul says it was according to the strictness of the Mosaical law. And of course, Paul, when he's referring to himself in Philippians chapter 3, he refers to himself as regarding the law a Pharisee. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But as he says here in chapter 22, as he's addressing the Sanhedrin, this is after chapter 21, after he's this is on the steps of Antonia. Sorry, this is on the steps of Antonia when he's preaching or teaching at the top of the stairs. The centurion had to go down and save him from the Sanhedrin. So now they're up at the steps of Antonia. He turns and he speaks in Hebrew, and all the people are listening here in chapter 22. He says, "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now." And when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. He said, "I am indeed a Jew, born of Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished." So, Paul describes kind of his background. And as soon as he brings up, I'm saying that Paul's name dropping here, but when he says, "I was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel," anybody who didn't know who Saul was, which I'm sure most people did, but anybody who didn't, wow, he was raised by Gamaliel. And that phrase brought up. Okay, I was reared here. I was raised here at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law. And in comparison to being a Sadducee, okay, remember the Sadducees were the ones who they were in the minority, but they had a lot of the wealth. Okay, the Pharisees, they loved money, but they didn't have a lot of the wealth. They just wanted it. You had the Essenes, and you had a couple other factions of the Jews as well. But the Sadducees are known for what? For not believing in what? The resurrection, or for that matter, a spiritual realm at all. Okay, they didn't believe in a spiritual realm. Whereas the Pharisees, in fact, this is the very thing Paul himself brought up just a couple chapters ago, in the midst of the Sanhedrin, what did the Pharisees believe? They believe there is going to be a resurrection one day. They believe there is a spiritual realm. And so that caused this rift in the Sanhedrin, and everybody was kind of talking back and forth, which kind of caused the commotion, which led to the lieutenant having to go rescue Paul. So he says that he was raised at the feet of Gamaliel, taught the strictness of our father's law. He was zealous toward God as you are all today. I mean, you look at Paul almost as like a perfect prodigy. Gamaliel, I'm sure was very proud of Paul in how very zealous Paul was for the law. And certainly, as Paul mentioned to the Sanhedrin, I have done everything in good conscience, thinking I was serving God. Okay, and certainly he was of the law, but then, of course, after the New Testament was established and so forth, he found himself to be fighting against God. But anyway, so that is regarding Gamaliel. That's the mention of Gamaliel there in Acts chapter 22. Thoughts or comments with that? And then in Acts chapter 5, he's mentioned again. We see how that Gamaliel was held in respect by all the people. And it suggests, because he was held in respect by all the people, it suggests he was well known and highly influential. Of course, that fits very well with the fact that he may very well have been either a senior member. Obviously, I think everybody agrees he was at least a senior member of the Sanhedrin, if not the leader of the Sanhedrin at that point. Again, except for the high priest, who technically had the leadership role, but from a civil perspective, a lot of times you had individuals who were president of that council or whatnot. And then in Acts chapter 5, we see his wisdom and the respect he has regarding God. And of course, Acts chapter 5 is the only time we actually see any interaction specifically with Gamaliel. We see, of course, in Acts chapter 4, how that the Sanhedrin had threatened Peter and John, told them not to preach in the name of Jesus anymore. They come back to the saints in chapter 4. They offer up a prayer to God. Here in chapter 5, they continue to teach in the name of the Lord. And starting in verse 22, when the officers came and did not find them in the prison, they returned and reported, "Indeed, we found the prison shut securely. No one's inside." Let's see. Verse 26, "The captain went with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people, lest they should be stoned. And when they brought them, they set them before the council. And the high priest asked them, saying, 'Did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring this man's blood on us.'" He's not wrong. It's not necessarily that the apostles are placing blame for the purpose of being resentful or anything like that, but the fact that, yeah, you guys were guilty, along with the rest of the people, as Paul acknowledged in Acts chapter 2. But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you murdered by hanging on a tree." They go on to describe the fact that he's now been raised and he's at the right hand of God. And in verse 33, when they heard this, they were furious and plotted to kill them. Okay, so the members of the Sanhedrin were all upset, all angry. But then, in verse 34, one in the council stood up, a Pharisee, so we know that he's a Pharisee too, named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in respect by all the people, and commanded them to put the apostles outside for a little while. So he wants to have a private conversation with the members of the council. Okay, I think that's, first of all, that's wisdom. Let's talk amongst each other here for a moment so that I can say what I need to say. And notice that he commanded them to put the apostles out for a little while, as if Gamaliel had the authority to have the apostles removed for a period of time. Okay, he didn't have to ask, "Hey, can I make a motion to remove the apostles for a minute?" and it had to go through, the leader or something like that. He commanded that they be taken out. So that again lends some credence to the idea that he had authority or influence. Verse 35, "He said to the men of Israel, 'Take heed to yourselves what you intend to do regarding these men.' For some time ago, Thetis rose up, claiming to be somebody. A number of men, about 400, joined him. He was slain, and all who obeyed him were scattered and came to nothing." So Gamaliel, he's going to use some examples. He says, be careful how you handle this. Because we had this fella, Thetis, however you pronounce his name. He claimed, now Gamaliel doesn't say he claimed to be a Messiah, but he claimed to be somebody. Very likely, didn't Jesus himself referred to there were false messiahs before. There's going to be others claiming to be Messiah after me. And so it's possible he claimed to be the deliverer or the Messiah of promise. But regardless, a number of people joined him, 400. After he was killed, all who obeyed him were scattered and came to nothing. There's nothing left of that little faction of whoever it was. After this man, Judas of Galilee rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him. And of course, the days of the census is about the same time as what happened? Jesus was born in the days of the census, remember? That's why Joseph and Mary were coming to Bethlehem. So after this, Judas of Galilee rose up the days of the census and drew away many people after him. He also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed. Now I say to you, so he brings up two examples of where when the leader of a particular sect or a particular following is killed, the members of it generally just kind of go away. It comes to nothing. I say to you, keep away from these men, let them alone. For if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing. But if it is of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you even be found to fight against God. Nolan?
Kind of makes me wonder if he offered this same advice back when Jesus was alive. Careful what you do with this guy.
Yeah, because he obviously would have been there. He would have been a part of that. That's true.
Or if it's perhaps because of Jesus and those events that he's come to this wisdom at this point.
Right.
And we don't know.
Right. But you definitely see the wisdom that this man, both in age, obviously, and experience has taught him, and experience of knowledge. Okay, now keep in mind that we're talking about 30 years or so between, 35 years or so between what happened in Matthew chapter 2 and chapter 3 at the birth of Jesus, and then now. Okay, so he's referencing things that happened a long time ago, that whether he was around personally for them, he certainly was knowledgeable of them. And then he says, you need to be very careful what you do about these men. Now, whether this is Gamaliel specifically, there are some who suggest he's showing faith that these men are indeed of God. We would like to think that. But from a wisdom's perspective, there's nothing here that says that he's necessarily believing these men are truly of God. More than it is just, let's let things play out and see what happens. Because if this is of men, well, that you've cut off the head, Jesus is dead. And so as a result, as what has happened with everyone else, it's going to die away if it's of men. But, and I think that this is a very important point, if it is of God, so notice the possibility that Gamaliel brings up, that Jesus, what if he was the Messiah? What if he was truly sent from God? And what if these men who are teaching in his name are truly from God, given power of God? Well, then what? Well, you cannot overthrow it because you're going to be fighting against God. And then you'll have to deal with that as well, give an account for having fought against God. But I think it's very important to note that Gamaliel opens up that possibility. What if they're telling the truth? What if what they're saying is right? Now, at the very least, Gamaliel's experience and wisdom has opened that possibility that maybe Gamaliel was himself open to the possibility that maybe they're telling the truth. Maybe this is something to look into more. And of course, it won't be until chapter 7 and chapter 8 that we see Paul being encountered and so forth, and everything happened with Saul. But I think that's a very interesting component that we see here, that Gamaliel had that open mind to say, if it's of God, you need to be aware, because you're going to be fighting against God. All right, we will stop there. We'll pick up here with the points about Gamaliel and move on to Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea next week. Thanks, everybody.